Mr. President, in just a short period of time, here in the Senate chamber, we will be voting on fast-track legislation designed to create a very quick path through the U.S. Senate for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and for trade agreements to come thereafter. So I rise now to share with my colleagues and to share with the American people my concerns about this course of action. It is President Kennedy who once said, quote, "The trade of a nation expresses in a very concrete way its aims and aspirations." What are our aims and aspirations in the context of this trade agreement and fast track? From my perspective, the thing that really matters is whether or not this trade agreement will create good-paying jobs or will destroy good-paying jobs. Will this trade agreement make the American economy work better for working Americans? And I feel it fails the test, and I'm going to explain why. Now, it is true that the trade agreement is complex, it's multidimensional. It has a dimension that deals with intellectual property, with the extension of copyrights and patents and protection for trade secrets, and that's certainly a win for protecting an innovation economy, innovation by Americans and American companies. And it has an agricultural section. And we've sought out an analysis of the agricultural section and don't have one yet, but those in the know say it's a good chance that the tariffs that are struck down and the non-tariff barriers that are struck down as barriers to U.S. products may, on balance, benefit the United States agricultural economy. I look forward to analysis to really examine that in detail. But the heart of the trade agreement is about manufacturing. We have multinational companies that are seeking to be able to make things at the lowest possible cost. That's the heart of this trade agreement, as with other trade agreements. And that means being able to incorporate into an economic circle countries where the costs are very low to make things. And that is certainly the case with this trade agreement. This trade agreement includes a couple countries that have no minimum wage and others that have a very low minimum wage. We're really talking about Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. Now, in Vietnam, they have a regional minimum wage. So it varies from place to place, and you hear different amounts, but roughly it's 60 to 75 cents per hour. Malaysia, it's $1.54. In Mexico, it's 66 cents. Well, those are all incredibly low compared to the American minimum wage of $7.25. And of course, many of our states have state minimum wages that are higher. But the minimum wage is only a part of the puzzle. When you include the costs of labor in the United States, you have to include such things as workers' compensation and set-aside expenses for Social Security and disability insurance, and the cost of maintaining safe working standards that are rigorously enforced. And so when you compare all of that, you probably have a labor ratio that is on the order of about 20 to 1. That is a playing field tilted against the American worker at a 20 to 1 ratio for manufacturing. That is certainly not a level playing field. Our companies will say time and time again, here in America, we will thrive with anyone in the world on a level playing field. But when the costs are 20 to 1, that is the costs overseas in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico are lower than the United States on a 20 to 1 ratio, that is a playing field steeply tilted against the United States. So it's no wonder that in previous agreements, we have seen an increase in trade deficits and a big loss of jobs here in the United States of America. Let's take a look at 3 of those cases. In 1993, we signed the North America Free Trade Agreement. and that incorporated Mexico into our economic circle. So let's compare the trade deficit in 1992, a year before, with 2014. In the course of those years, the trade deficit increased from $5.3 billion to $53.8 billion. That is a massive, massive change. Now, by various estimates, that translates into a job loss of between 480,000 jobs to 680,000 jobs. So 500,000 Americans lost good-paying jobs as a result of NAFTA. Or let's take a look at China. Well, China came into the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in the year 2000. So let's compare 1999 with 2014. The trade deficit went from $68.7 billion to $343 billion. That is $250 billion increase, and that's a deficit. That is not a collective amount, that's an annual amount. And by various estimates, that is a result of job losses between 2.7 million and 3.2 million American jobs lost. Or let's look at South Korea. Remember how folks said that this will facilitate so much access to consumers in South Korea that won't have a big impact on our trade deficit. And yet, South Korea, the agreement was signed in 2011 or ratified. So comparing 2010 to 2014, just 4 years, the trade deficit ballooned. It ballooned from $10 billion to $25 billion. And the resulting job losses are estimated to have been between 75,000 and 150,000 jobs. Now, when I say jobs, maybe that's abstract. So let's translate this to families. Between the low estimates and the high estimates, we are talking about 3.3 million to 4 million American families losing their job, a good-paying manufacturing job. You know, there is no better foundation for a family than a good-paying job. So when we pull away that foundation by striking agreements that send our jobs overseas, that is utterly devastating to families across our nation, certainly families in my home state of Oregon, and certainly families in every single state. So you can't be pro-family and also be for shipping our good-paying jobs overseas. There is no government program that substitutes for a good-paying job. And that's why I'm so deeply disturbed about the outlines of the agreement that we're undertaking. Because each and every time that improvements to wages here in the U.S. will come up, the makers will say, if you raise your wages, if you add family vacation or family leave or sick leave or medical leave or help with daycare for your children, you know what? We may just have to move our manufacturing overseas, or we may have to move our supply chain overseas, or we may have to produce less at the factory here and more at the factory overseas. And it doesn't stop there. The construction that is envisioned by our multinational manufacturers in pursuit of their lost cost production is not just to play off the United States against Malaysia, or the United States against Mexico, or the United States against Vietnam. Although all of that will happen, it's also to play off each of those low-cost countries against each of them. So they can say to China, that has a certain cost structure and is not yet envisioned to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but does benefit from the WTO access, they can say, China, your costs are going up. Oh, you're enforcing those environmental laws and your costs are going up. Oh, you're adding health standards, labor standards, your costs are going up. You're paying overtime, your costs are going up. We're going to shift more of our manufacturing to Malaysia. And if you keep at it, we'll shift all of it. Or Malaysia, You're just close by to Vietnam. Your costs go up, we're going to shift more to Vietnam. Or to Vietnam, you raise your standards, you raise your costs, you raise your pay, you raise your standard of living, we're going to move those jobs to Mexico. So this is a tremendous leverage if you are an owner of a multinational, if you own stock in a multinational, if you are an investor in a multinational, because you can produce your product at a lower cost by playing off economy against economy, and you sell it at the world market price, you make more money. But if you are a worker in the United States who is being played against a worker in Vietnam, it's a bad deal. And if you're a worker in Vietnam being played off against a worker in Malaysia, it's a bad deal. That's not all that's wrong with this arrangement. Let's look at the various things that could have made Fast Track stronger, that are not in Fast Track. Now, we've heard a lot of conversation, a lot of presentation, that this is a gold standard framework, that this is a new style of trade agreement. But the fact is, key provisions that could have made it a gold standard or a new strategy are not there. Let's start with the fact that there is no minimum wage required in this agreement. Not even a minimum wage of $1 an hour, which would have certainly affected Mexico and Vietnam. And no mechanism, were there a minimum wage, to increase it gradually over time to help lift up workers in our poorest nations and to reduce the gap, level out the playing field between low-wage countries and high-wage countries like the United States. Second, the agreement does not address currency manipulation. Everyone in international trade understands that tariffs can be replaced by a pseudo-tariff through currency manipulation, through intervention in the currency markets. In 2009, when I came to the US Senate, our economists estimated, that the currency manipulation by China amounted to a 25% tariff on American products and a 25% subsidy to Chinese products. Why would we agree to an arrangement where currency manipulation can produce a tariff against our products and a subsidy to our competitors within that framework? Third, we have had a problem with the loss of our sovereignty on health issues and environmental issues, consumer issues, by giving that sovereignty away, that decision-making away to an international panel. Just weeks ago, under the World Trade Organization structure, WTO structure, we lost a case, and the outcome of that case was that here in America, we are not allowed to label our meat produced in America. That's a loss of our sovereignty. I want to live in America where if our consumers, if our policymakers, if our legislators believe it's in the best interest of this nation for our consumers to be able to know where their meat is raised, if our consumers want to exercise some patriotic decision-making and support American ranchers, they ought to be able to do so. We ought to be able to have that law, not give away our lawmaking authority to an international panel. So this investor-state dispute settlement panel of 3 corporate lawyers who can be advocates in one case and the judges in the next does not provide anything close to an appropriate mechanism to decide issues of health and safety and environment. We could have taken those off the table so that if we want to control a dangerous environmental toxin like cancer-causing flame retardants in our carpets, we can do so without going afoul of trade agreements. But there was no effort to protect our health and safety here in America in this trade agreement. If we really believed that we were going to have a new order agreement, we would have an enforcement mechanism for labor standards and for environmental standards. And we've heard folks talk on the floor about there are such new enforcement standards. And so I'm aggrieved to report to you that that is simply not the case. Now, let's start with the fact that we could have required the passage of laws before countries are admitted into the trade agreement, required that they bring their environmental standards and their legal standards, their labor standards up to snuff before admission, and then show that they were actually implementing them. Have a 2-year demonstration period to show that they're actually enforcing them. Because that's the easiest point at which to bring nations accountable before they are members of the trade agreement, before they get the lower tariffs. That's the point you have incentive. That's the point you have leverage. But there was no effort to force countries, to require countries to meet those minimum standards before being admitted into this trade agreement. We could have had some form of snapback provision that said if you fail in bringing your laws into accordance on the environmental side or the labor side, if you fail to enforce your laws, then tariffs snap back. But there is no snapback provision in this agreement. We could have expanded the dumping provisions in international law to give a way to take on situations where countries are producing below cost because they're not abiding by the goals in the environmental or the labor area. But there is no such provision envisioned or required in fast track or anticipated in Trans-Pacific Partnership. There has been, in the course of our trade agreements, only one situation that we challenged labor laws, and it was with Guatemala. We challenged them 7 years ago, and to date, that case has never been adjudicated. It is virtually impossible, after a country has failed to come up to standards, to go back and retroactively enforce these standards without some new mechanism, some new strategy. But there is no new mechanism or strategy that applies in this situation. Nothing that would solve the Guatemala case and actually end up with it being adjudicated. To continue with the challenges to this fast track, the failures of this fast track, there is nothing in this that provides for Congress to be consulted when other nations dock, that is, tie on to the framework that will exist in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So when we had an amendment here on the floor that if China was to try to dock with the TPP and become a TPP fully privileged member, that it would have to come back to the United States for consideration. That gives us a chance to look at China's currency manipulation or China's cheating on international intellectual property. It would give us a chance to examine a whole facet of things, but no requirement like that exists. And to add on to everything else, now, because of the way that this process has proceeded, there is no guarantee that there will be trade adjustment assistance for families that lose their jobs when their jobs go overseas. No assistance in training. Now, I find it absurd that the same folks who say there will be virtually no jobs lost proceed to say the cost of compensating families by giving some minimal training to them when they lose their jobs will be vastly expensive. America can't afford it. So on one hand, they say no jobs lost. The other side, they say so many jobs lost, it will be too expensive for our nation to afford. And so they're okay leaving American families not only stranded without a job, but stranded with no training to try to find a new job in the economy. If we go back to where I started with President Kennedy and his vision that the trade of a nation expresses in a concrete way its aims and its aspirations. Our aim should be to create good-paying jobs here in America. Our aspiration should be to create a trade agreement that works for working families. Unfortunately, this trade agreement is constructed around a different aspiration, one of maximizing the value of stock in multinational manufacturing corporations, and that is done by shipping our jobs overseas. That is the wrong aim for this nation. It is the wrong aim for our working families. We have seen the impact of Korea. We've seen the impact of China joining the WTO. We've seen the impact of Mexico and NAFTA. And as a result, we have lost millions of good-paying jobs here in our nation. and undermine the success of millions of American families. Now, there's a lot of conversation here on the floor of the Senate about inequality in our nation. You know what drives inequality? Well, I'll tell you. It's this: when you create trade agreements that are great for investors but are terrible for workers, that drives inequality. And that's why I encourage my colleagues to vote no when it comes to the fast-track legislation being voted on later today. It's wrong for America because it's wrong to solving inequality. It's wrong for America because it's wrong for working families to have their jobs shipped overseas. It's wrong because it does not fulfill the vision of working for working America. Thank you, Mr. President.